Greetings, pot pickers. DJ Boulders here from Beaumont and Billy's Bar, which is alive and well. Actually, that's a lie. It's as dead as a dodo. So I've moved to the Hammersmith Odeon, otherwise known as the Apollo Eventim, or whatever it's called now. And I'm just going to go through what happened in the 70s and a little bit of a nod to the 80s. So the wardrobe's a bit of a mixture of the two of them, really. Some interesting choices. We've got a couple of lists here to go through and some interesting omissions, one of which is probably playing in the background if you can hear it now. Couple of lists. We got some mainstream stuff, we got some French stuff, and we got Lav's list. So if you look at it, you know, if we go through it sort of vaguely alphabetically, the highlights of the 70s, Aja, Steely Dan, Abraxas made a few lists, Argus, Wishbone Ash. I should also add that we've got Doherty's list, which for somebody who was aged about 8 when all this started, either you didn't go to school or it was a remarkably musically oriented little prep school somewhere in Edinburgh. But if I look at some of yours, mate, I mean, I'm surprised. Most of us were listening to Chicory Tip around about your age, but you were listening to Biter Later, Nick Drake. I mean, that just wasn't like happening in the early 70s where we were, but maybe north of the border, maybe it was. Atom Heart Mother got in there. I think that was Howard, a great album. Wishbone Ash, obviously. And then we got After the Gold Rush. There's a lot of Neil Young in here. There's a lot of James Taylor. There's a little bit of Carole King. There's a bit of Joni Mitchell. And of course, Joni Mitchell, James Taylor, Carole King were all recording in the same building at the same time, back when she did Tapestry. Joni was doing Blue, and James was doing anything that he could hear through the walls, really. So then we got Born to Run, obviously Bill Bryson's choice, predictable. A lot of Stones. We've got Bound on the Run. So just moving over a little bit from the mainstream stuff, we'll go over to the Lav list. We've got Jesus of Cool, Nick Lowe. We've got Spirit. We've got, hang on, glasses on. We've got Weather Report. I listened to that the other day. That was interesting. Van der Graaf Generator. We've got a bit of Wire. We've got a bit of Marianne Faithfull. So Lav, as ever, mixing it up in a Crunchy Tiger type of way. Back to the rest of us. The boys from Crawley came in with their first album, 3 inspiring boys. They're still going. 50 years later on, they still haven't found a cure. Remarkable. Derek and Clive, Derek and the Dominoes, Carpenters, my first ever single. Deep Purple, thank you to Paul Self at school for introducing me to them. And thank you to Howard for taking me backstage to the Deep Purple concert some years ago in New Jersey at Jones Beach, which was marginally disappointing. I mean, everyone was drinking green tea. Ian Gillan didn't come out of his dressing room. We went home at halftime. There was no sex. There was no drugs. There was a bit of rock and roll, but it wasn't really what I expected backstage. Elton John, obviously, with an album a month, right the way through the 70s. Lav and I met him in the 80s. More of that, obviously, in the next decade. Exile on Main Street, one of the great Stones albums, and one of which Garv, Bill and I picked up and put back in the rack many, many times in Sutton Records in Dorchester. Earth, Wind and Fire Revolving Drum Kit gets an honourable mention. Southampton Gaumont featuring strongly in the mid to late 70s. Genesis, they're touring again this year. Phil's back. He can't stand up. He's the last man standing. His son's on the drums. He's obviously gotten through the vodka years, but back in the 70s, to be fair, you know, they were pretty big. We didn't have any Peter Gabriel in the 70s. Surprising, obviously big. Maybe he's going to resurface in the 80s. Bowie, big mention, big concert for Lav, big concert for me at Bournemouth Winter Gardens, Hunky Dory in there. Ziggy Stardust, the most expensive record I've ever bought. I think I bought it in a Guildford vinyl store 2 days after he died, and the price had gone through the roof for one of the first editions, but that didn't matter. John Martin, Solid Air, incredible. Doc snapped that one up before I could get there. And then, of course, to prove that we were all pretty good at school, Lynyrd Skynyrd, spelt Leyenoeraid. Anyway, not bad. Live at Leeds by The Who, Quadrophenia, Led Zepp 3, 4, 1, 2, Physical Graffiti, Nod to the Beatles back in 1970 with Let It Be, Technicality, I suppose they were probably going, it had all gone a little bit tits up for them. They'd all gone to New York. John had gone to Tokyo. None of them wanted to be on the Apple music label. They didn't have enough money to buy their music rights back in the late 60s. What a mess, which brings me on to Blondie. Great band, featured on a couple of lists. Just read her autobiography, quite depressing. Like any great rock group, they made it big. They made it so big that they had no money by the time they made it big, because nobody had done any accounting, and they were artists. And it was a little bit depressing because it was all about New York in the early 70s, and New York in the early 70s was pretty much buggered. Manassas, Stephen Stills, huge impact on a number of us, really. Quite surprising. Dark Horse, you wouldn't have put your money on that being possibly voted in the top 5 in the 70s, but on the Lav list might be in his top 5 of all time. So let's see what happens over the next few decades. Malpractice, Dr. Feelgood, saw them behind me in that very same auditorium. Fantastic, great band, still touring, and I've since seen them in Camberley and Collop Wapping Tiverton Village Hall. I don't think it was the original lineup, though. I'm just guessing, but I don't think it was. A lot of milk and alcohol. Moondance, Miserable Git Van gets in there with a couple of them. Not surprising. Seen him a couple of times. Miserable Git, saw him with Georgie Fame. Made Georgie seem like one of the great comics of all time. And then we're going to have a little mention about Andy Irvine, who managed the Lions when they went to Australia some years back and played with distinction for Scotland at fullback whilst he was knocking out the odd single in the 70s. Best-ish Southern album of all time, Rumours, Fleetwood Mac. Worst ever follow-up album to Rumours, to any album, in fact, Tusk, but still good enough to get on the list. Regatta de Blanc, remember the Police early days, quite remarkable. I think we're about to get their Coronavirus single re-released, Don't Stand So Close to Me, quite soon. Bit more James Taylor, back to Tapestry, lovely Carole King, Supertramp, Status Quo, The Stranglers, my last concert before lockdown. 10cc, who could forget them? Frank Zappa got onto Garv's list. And then obviously, yes, with some pretty weird stuff, but quite easy to understand in the early days. So there you have it. More from the Lav list. Little Feat, obviously global domination in the 70s. Spirit, the Bootsie's Rubber Band brand, which, yeah, big. So on that note, I'm going to say happy Saturday evening, and looking forward to receiving your 80s selections starting with 1980. I think that was the year I went to see ABC behind me in this fantastic auditorium, but looking forward to resuming. And I think this outfit is going to probably last me another decade before the 90s arrives. Well done, guys. Fantastic list. Great to get some French input in the second half of the decade. I've got to make an honorable mention, obviously, for Jean-Michel Jarre. We want some footage of Eric being in the gay bar. We want some footage of him dancing with Plastic Bertrand. or preferably Vanessa Paradis, to be honest. But Eric, thanks for what you've put into this, mate. Quite remarkable. I mean, Jacques Brel, who'd have thought it? But, you know, vive la différence. And we're looking for some oxygen and some air supply in the 80s. So lots of love to everyone, and stay well, stay safe, and crack on with the 80s.